Chapter 85. The clank and grinding of gears jarred Tarek from his unexpected slumber. Jason and Kerr were also awakened from the unbearable noise and vibrations from the gate as it began to open. Tarek was already on his feet, assisting Jason and then Kerr to stand. They walked and climbed between the beams, reaching a maintenance deck, which they had to climb up and onto, leaving the retreating gate. As the gateway opened completely, several transport ships began to descend to the base deck below. From their vantage point, Tarek, Jason, and Kerr watched while black-cladded troops began to disembark from the 3 transport ships. The interior of the base was a technological marvel. It was large enough to house a troop division, with enough deck space to accommodate a strike group. Tarek, Jason, and Kerr watched as additional ships descended, unloading more and more troops. "There is no way this place was constructed by the Gnomons alone," Kerr proclaimed. "I agree with you on that," Jason replied. "These troops are not Gnomon," Tarek stated as he turned, monitoring the maintenance deck. "Do you have the mag viewers?" Kerr asked. Tarek took the viewer from its case hanging from his side and handed them to Kerr. Kerr focused the viewers on the troops below, as they began to assemble in an unrecognized formation. The troops wore a tin-shielded helmet which hid their faces, but as an officer emerged from one of the transport ship, Kerr focused on the officer's face. "They're Myans," Kerr said as he glanced at Tarek. He went back to observing the movement of the troops, noting their garb, the ships and the structure of the base itself. Several levels up from the deck, he noted the base's observation and command center. Dozens of officers occupied the center, busily carrying out their duties. "They're preparing for something," Jason added as he looked around. He stuck out his hand toward Kerr, gesturing for the mag viewers. Kerr handed them to Jason. As they continued to survey the base, another series of 3 transport ships descended, unloading their cargo of troops. Anya stood in her robe, her hair dripping water as she peered down at the beautiful silky blue dress laid out on her bed. It was beautiful, what there was of it, a cowl neck with thin adjustable straps. She felt embarrassed to wear such a dress in public, and she was a bit surprised that her father would choose such a dress for her to wear. But she knew why he wanted her to wear it. Any man would surrender to the woman with that dress hanging from her frame. Anya dried her hair, disrobed, and lifted the dress, noticing how light and thin it was. She considered not wearing it at all. But in the end, she decided that it was the perfect dress for making a statement. Anya slipped into the soft thin dress, loving how it felt against her skin. As she adjusted the dress, she observed her reflection, and was shocked. The graceful lines of her petite body seemed to transfer right through the fabric of the dress. Although she absolutely loved the way it felt and looked on her, she didn't want anyone else to see her in it. And then she changed her mind, and she wished Wilhelm could see her in it. She fingered the delicate silk fabric as it glistened under the dimmed light from the room, imagining Wilhelm's hands caressing her waist. She had never worn a dress that revealed so much of her. She pulled up on the low neckline of the dress, trying to cover her exposed chest. No jewelry was needed with this dress, she was the jewel. She sat in front of a mirror and put up her hair. Her eyes watered, giving her trouble, as she tried to enhance her facial features. She wanted Wilhelm to see her, she wanted to see him melt for her. She closed her eyes, imagining Wilhelm's lips against hers, forcing her mouth to open as he drank from her lips. She touched her fingers to her lips, trying desperately to simulate what she desired. She unclosed her lips over her finger. gently pulling her finger into her opened mouth. But it wasn't enough. She moaned, trembling in her desire for Wilhelm. "I love you, Wilhelm," she bemoaned, as she wiped her tears and then stood to review her final preparations. She wrapped her arms around her waist and looking down she tried to compose herself, drawing in a deep breath. She reached for her satchel, retrieving the Sakat and the Iconep bottle. She pulled the blade from its sheath and taking the bottle she sat again before her mirror. She bent the handle revealing a small hole. She laid the blade on her desk and uncapped the bottle. With one hand she lifted the blade and tilting the bottle she poured, watching the deadly liquid slide through the hole on the blade. She stopped pouring when the liquid overflowed over the blade. Using a towel, she wiped the excess and tossed the towel out of sight. She then placed the cap back onto the bottle and snapped the Sakat back into place. Anya took a deep breath observing the Sakat through the mirror. She sat mustering up her courage while suppressing the last spark of hope inside of her. She ran her finger along the blade avoiding the sharp edge. Grasping the blade with both hands she turned the tip of the blade towards her chest. Her tears began to flow as her lips began to quiver. The blade began to shake and she tried to still her hands but was unable. She felt herself losing her nerve, so she inched the blade closer. A small drop of the poison fell from the tip of the blade and onto her chest, but she didn't notice as the drop descended between her breasts. Anya closed her eyes and took a deep breath and held it as she pushed the tip of the blade into her chest. The blade was so sharp that she hadn't even noticed that the tip of the blade slipped into her chest, drawing a stream of blood as it mixed with the cloudy liquid from the blade. Anya kept pushing until she felt a sharp pain in her chest. She quickly opened her eyes and was shocked how deeply she had inserted the blade. She pulled out the tip, crying in pain, and she threw down the blade. She sat there shocked, watching the blood oozing from her chest, staining that beautiful dress. She had done it. There was no turning back now. Anya stood and walked over to her bed and drawing away the sheets she laid down as the blood poured from her chest onto the bed. She closed her eyes as her tears escaped through them. Wilhelm knew the face but he had never met the man. He had seen him accompanying Anya from time to time. He debated whether he should reveal himself, but he feared the reaction of the guard. "The Lady Anya has requested a priest," the guard replied. Yutiro was skeptical. He knew Anya was not very religious and that for the most part she avoided anything having to do with religion. Besides, if she had any interest, it would be among the cows. Yutiro stood in front of the priest observing him closely. "Very well, keep a close eye on him," Yutiro directed to the guard. "I will, sir," the guard replied. Yutiro stepped to one side as the guard and Wilhelm walked past. Yutiro continued to observe them until they were out of sight. As they continued to walk, turning left, and then turning right, taking stairs to the next floor, Wilhelm had no idea where he was being led. His excitement was building as he traveled deeper into the palace. Suddenly he bumped into the guard. The guard had stopped in front of a beautifully decorated entryway with double doors. Wilhelm held his breath as the guard reached out and pressed a button on the threshold. Wilhelm heard nothing, but he imagined Anna rising at the sound and walking over to the door. But no one came. The guard reached out a second time and pressed the button. They waited, and waited, for what seemed like forever to Wilhelm. He was finally here, on her planet, in her home, at her door, and, would he miss her? He thought about all he went through to get here, the pain he still felt from the burns, the broken ribs, hypersickness. Wilhelm wanted to bang on the door. When the guard turned toward him, Wilhelm immediately took out his pad and wrote, "Please try again." For the third time, the exasperated guard reached out and pressed the button once more, and they waited. Wilhelm began to hyperventilate, moaning as he did. In response to the priest's reaction, the guard reached down and placed his hand on his weapon. Just then, the door of Anya's room cracked open. Wilhelm held his breath as the door opened, but from his vantage point he could not see who opened the door. The guard removed his hand from the vicinity of his weapon and stood at attention. The door opened just enough for the person inside to see outside while not being seen by those at the entryway. "My lady, so sorry to disturb you," the guard said apologetically. "I have this visitor who says that you requested his presence." There was silence for a moment as the guard waited for a response. Wilhelm could not hear the reply, but whatever she said, it prompted the guard to repeat his statement. "I have this visitor who says that you requested his presence," he repeated. Wilhelm could see the door open wider and the most beautiful face he had ever seen protruded out and turned to look at him. Wilhelm nearly fainted on seeing her. His eyes began to flood over, blurring his sight. "I think you're mistaken," Anya replied, stuttering. In her words, Wilhelm sensed that something was wrong. She barely got out the words and she sounded so weak. Wilhelm stepped up out of concern, causing the guard to push him back. "Sorry to disturb you, my lady," the guard said while grabbing onto Wilhelm as he again tried to step up. The door started to close. Wilhelm pulled out his pad and chalk and wrote, "Give her the ring." The guard began to search his person for the ring that was removed from the priest's finger. Wilhelm watched nervously until the guard found it. "My lady, I'm sorry. I was told to give this to you." There was silence for a longer period of time, and then the door opened wider as a weakened Anya stepped out covered in a sheet, nearly stumbling over it. "Where did you get this?" Anya insisted. "Where did you get this?" Wilhelm erased the text on his pad, glancing at the guard. Then he wrote, "Anya, let me in." He showed it only to her. Anya took Wilhelm's arm and pulled him, but she was not strong enough to budge him. "Thank you," she said dismissively to the guard. The guard promptly left. "Come?" Anya asked, her eyes wide and wild. Wilhelm walked through the doorway. Anya immediately closed the door, engaging the lock. She held up the ring. "Where did you get it?" Wilhelm began to take off the robe. He threw it to one side. His eyes were full of tears as he looked into the face he thought he would never see again. Anya nearly fell to the ground, but Wilhelm caught her, his arm holding her up. "Oh, Wilhelm. Wilhelm." His name in her voice was too much for him. He held her close, and when he felt her standing under her own power, he took his hands and caressed her face, finding her lips. He kissed her deeply. Anna returned his kiss, calling out his name, muffled by their kisses. Wilhelm held her waist, pulling her into him, kissing her, tasting her tears. Then, suddenly, she went limp. Wilhelm held her as she completely lost consciousness. He picked her up in the sheet and carried her to her bed. That's when he saw the blood on her bed. He laid her on the bed, noticing her bloody dress. He saw the puncture wound in her chest that was still oozing blood. He walked over to her vanity desk to look for a towel. Finding one, he started to go back to her, but then, he noticed the dagger with its tip covered in blood. "Oh Anya, what have you done?"